2, 1, and we are recording one day after the 57th anniversary of JFK's assassination, and fittingly have on Jefferson Morley, whose book, The Ghost, about James Jesus Angleton, the head of CIA counterintelligence for a time. The book, it'll be in the thumbnail, the description, and in the top comment. I absolutely loved it, but before I get onto that, you are an accomplished author, so let me read you a little bio that I've got. Jefferson Morley is a veteran Washington journalist. He has worked for 15 years at the Washington Post and a host of liberal publications, including The Nation, Salon, New Republic, and Arms Control Today. He's the co-founder and editor of the blog JFK Facts, which has attracted some 2.7 million visitors since it was launched in 2012. Morley is the author of the forthcoming book, Morley v. CIA, My Unfinished JFK Investigation, which tells the story of a 16-year-long lawsuit to obtain certain ancient JFK assassination records. This roller coaster saga puts him on a collision course with Judge, now Justice, Brett Kavanaugh. You can order Morley v. CIA on Amazon. Sorry, I'm a little excited. I'm butchering my words. Morley is also the author of 2 CIA biographies. Both tell the story of powerful CIA officers deeply involved in the events that led to JFK's assassination. The first is Our Man in Mexico, where he tells the story of Win Scott, the CIA station chief in Mexico in 1963. Scott, one of the CIA's most accomplished officers, oversaw the surveillance of accused assassin Lee Harvey Oswald in Mexico City 6 weeks before JFK was killed. Scott later wrote a memoir saying that the CIA had duped the Warren Commission, and a key point about Oswald. Scott wrote that he believed JFK had been killed by a conspiracy. When Scott died, the CIA seized and suppressed his memoir. You can order that, Our Man in Mexico, published by the University of Kansas Press, from your local brick-and-mortar bookstore. In The Ghost, which today's episode is about, and I absolutely love it, you will not be disappointed. In The Ghost, Morley tells the life story of the legendary James Jesus Angleton, paranoid genius and chief of the CIA counterintelligence. The Ghost shows that Angleton and his staff closely monitored Lee Harvey Oswald's personal life, his politics, and his contacts with then Cuban and Russian intelligence officers in the 4 years before JFK was killed. Angleton was deeply interested in the erratic ex-Marine but took no action. Indeed, Angleton was notified that Oswald was in Texas a week before JFK was killed. The Ghost, like Our Man in Mexico, offers no JFK theory, only facts, and I can attest that is true. Angleton was responsible for the atrocious counterintelligence failure that culminated in Dealey Plaza. You can order The Ghost, published by St. Martin's Press, from your local brick-and-mortar bookstore. You can also get a signed copy of The Ghost at jeffersonmorleybooks.com. I will have that in the top link as well as the description. Mr. Morley joins us from his home in Washington, D.C., and very graciously has decided to come on my podcast. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you, Tommy. Let's talk. Tell me why you wanted to talk to me.
I love everything. So I've had on this podcast several times before Dale Comstock, who is the youngest ever member of Delta Force. He's now retired.
Mm-hmm.
Could probably still outrun any Olympic athlete. He's a tank.
Mm-hmm.
But he was in Delta Force, obviously Tier 1, right? You got Rangers, Delta Force, you got Navy SEALs, and then you have SEAL Team 6 or DevGru, right? Just kind of the tippy top. And with all things, whether it's that or missiles or biology or whatever, or computers, I've always been interested in hierarchies of things.
Mm-hmm.
And growing up, I had always read about, like a kid, what is higher than a Ranger or Delta Force. And eventually I got to, well, what would be higher than that? And it was the CIA Special Activities Division, SAD, right, which is the proverbial black ops. They are not under the Department of Defense. They are under Title 50.
Right.
They do the stuff that we didn't do.
Right.
Mr. Comstock was in that division. He cannot legally say he was.
Right.
He was in OGA, other government agency. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. But I've had him on the podcast, and he cannot say it, and so he doesn't.
Right.
But so to say that is, and I remember one time on the phone, we were talking about intelligence agencies and schemes and campaigns. And we were talking about, as you get higher and higher up, because he also did mercenary work for the State Department, which is the State Department would hire him through another nation, it's just all legal framework to really, go take out the guys. Talks about flying. He's like, I didn't go there on a military jet. He's like, I'd fly there first class on a 747. You take a cab out to the desert. You take a chopper to another cab. They give you some garments, and you get a gun off the black market. He's like, there is no footprint. And so talking to him is like this real life James Bond. And the point of all of that rant is to say, I remember asking him, I was like, so what's above you? Is there like another? And he said, Tom, I'll tell you this, when you get to the upper echelons of the CIA, it turns into, quote, a foggy forest of mirrors. And that sent chills down my spine. And that was about in April. And I've always been interested about what are these things with plausible deniability built into the very fabric of them? Like, are these guys that are just, they are the puppet behind the puppet? And
So, it's a good question. And I think what's interesting about James Angleton, chief of CIA counterintelligence from 1954 to 1974, was that he was really running a CIA within the CIA.
Yeah.
And this was not something that was designed that way. The idea of having a counterintelligence staff was actually Angleton's idea. Mm-hmm. He sold CIA Director Allen Dulles on the idea in 1954. There never had been one before. The CIA was afflicted by a series of embarrassing intelligence failures in the 1950s. The KGB was running rings around them in a lot of ways. The KGB was a very professional service and had a lot more experience. The Russians had been running an intelligence agency since the 20s. Mm-hmm. The CIA was pretty much, with British training, was brand new in 1947. So as a result of this, the Russians were able to penetrate CIA operations, operate with extensive networks in the United States. And so Angleton wanted to do something about that. And his solution was the counterintelligence staff. Because he was an adept and intellectually charismatic figure, he was able to persuade the upper echelons of the CIA to give him this wide berth. And so, the job of the counterintelligence staff, counterintelligence is the defensive aspect of secret intelligence work, right? You go out, you try and steal the other guy's secrets, change his psychology, whatever. And then counterintelligence is you're trying to prevent the other guy from doing that to you. And so that was the basic orientation of counterintelligence. But Angleton had from his earliest days, training with British intelligence, the idea that counterintelligence could also be used for offensive operations. And this is really what Angleton did. His successors explained that he didn't really, opposed to, going by his job title, chief of the counterintelligence staff, you might think that he ran a staff of people with counterintelligence duties. It didn't really work that way. He ran an operations organization that was very tightly held and whose files were not integrated into the central file registry of the CIA. So even people at the CIA did not know what Angleton was up to. And when he was fired in disgrace at the end of his career, one of the things that the CIA spent a lot of time trying to figure out was just what the hell he had been doing for those 20 years, because they really didn't know. And they went into his files with some trepidation because they really didn't know. And it was an anomalous situation for the CIA. And I learned in the course of doing this book, you learn about who are the admired people in the CIA history. Angleton is a controversial figure, even within the CIA. And so, for example, in 1997, the CIA had a big ceremony. They called it 50 for 50, and they were 50 CIA personalities who had contributed to the agency in a major way. Angleton was not in that list of top 50, because a lot of people who really, he had done domestic spying, he had kept secrets from the agency, he had theories about Soviet KGB penetration of the CIA that were controversial, and I would say unfounded. So anyway, his legacy, even within the CIA, was controversial, and outside it was very controversial. He was, as I explain in the book, the Justice Department spent a lot of time thinking about whether he should be charged for a massive domestic surveillance operation. illegal, not created by Congress, not ordered by the president, just dreamed up by James Angleton. And in 1977, right before President Jimmy Carter took office, the Justice Department decided not to prosecute him. So Angleton leaves a very big and very controversial legacy. But what's extraordinary about him, and I think what my book shows that previous books about him had not shown, was he had a range of influence over US intelligence operations that was very, very wide. He was deeply involved in Cuba. He was involved in multiple conspiracies to assassinate Fidel Castro in Cuba. He played the leading role in the investigation of whether there was a mole within the CIA. He had a very prominent role as handling the liaison with Israel and the Mossad. Mm-hmm. So he had this mass surveillance program that he created and ran called Lingual. Mm-hmm. So his impact was felt on a wide range of issues. I say that he was the most important unelected official in the U.S. government in this period, and I think that's true based on the results that he got. Yeah. He was a very powerful man and a very unaccountable one. Yeah. So that's why his story is so interesting.
Yeah.
And
yeah,
there it is. And like you said, thank you for that introduction. You can buy it at your local bookstore. You can order a signed copy from my website, Jefferson Morley Books. So
that will be in the description and in the top comment, as well as Kindle and Audible. Great Audible narrator. I'd like to add, I had on an Audible narrator yesterday. I figured I had on so many authors, and eventually had on a narrator. Yeah. But great, it's great on Audible. I love it. Some narrators really do. They can ruin a book, and you got a good one. So for everyone, for my generation at least, that won't sit down and read, it's a good listen. And it's it's not. The reason I like it is because it's sexy without trying to be sexy. It's not what it is just facts, right? And it's laid out in front of you, Mr. Morley. I think I just lost.
Yeah, and I should say, I come from a kind of left liberal point of view. That's my politics. But anybody who reads this book, if you have different politics, you'll still understand who it is. I mean, I make my judgments, but he was a very interesting man, and people who liked him really, really admired him. And so while I was critical in a lot of ways, I also wanted to convey that sense that this was an impressive man to a lot of people. You might not have liked what he did, but there were reasons why people liked him. So I want to make sure people understand that about the book too. It's not an anti-CIA book, although it's quite critical of Angleton.
Yeah, no, absolutely. No, you do a very good job at just presenting. I could not have guessed what your politics were from it. I just thought it was a great history of them, and it's what I kind of took from it was like very loosely, almost kind of Curtis LeMay, Patton, MacArthur, where they have their enemies, but those who are under them love them and will walk into the gates of hell behind them. Yes. That's what I got. That's the vibe I got from Angleton, is like, sure, has a lot of critics, and probably rightly so, but he's also the guy, right? It's almost like Jack Nicholson, like, you want me on that wall, you need me on that wall. Angleton, looks exactly like you think he would look like. That's kind of the guy where, like, it's you don't want the CIA doing bad shit, and then 9/11 happens, and you watch people jumping to their deaths and burning alive, and all of a sudden you're like, screw it, let's go open some black sites, let's go open Guantanamo. In that moment, you kind of get a little comfortable with a Dick Cheney. You're like, maybe let's use Darth Cheney, he's on our side, he's a pit bull, let's and then after a while they get off the leash and you got to reel them back in. But like, after a JFK assassination, which maybe he did or didn't have a hand in, after a Cuban Missile Crisis, World War II is only 15 years in the rearview mirror.
This was the origins of the counterintelligence staff. This was in 54. The Korean War had just ended. This feeling that World War III could be right around the corner was very pervasive in Washington, and so senior officials like Angleton, who had, well thought out plans in the national security area, if they could make a strong case, they could gain a lot of power. And that's exactly what Angleton did. Was he talked his way from a sort of an upper level, but not top tier position in the foreign intelligence wing of the CIA into a position of supreme bureaucratic power. And once he had it, he didn't let go for 20 years. And for much of that time, he was very much admired. At the end, people began to sour on him and his thinking became rigid. His alcoholism got worse. And I think in the final years, that sense of, oh, here's somebody we got to follow, that was starting to fade. And people in the CIA were saying, no, this guy's off base and we can't do this. So he's at the end, the last 4 or 5 years, he became controversial even within the CIA.
Yeah. It's almost like what Kennedy said about LeMay. He was like, you don't want LeMay deciding whether or not we go into battle, but if we are in battle, you want LeMay leading the charge, right? LeMay was, he used to send like B-47s at top speed to the Russian Soviet border and then turn around. And I think one of his like paraphrasing quotes is like, if we're lucky one of these days, they'll start launching their nukes. And it was like, he legitimately, World War II, taking out mainland Japan, you want a LeMay, right? But it's kind of, as it went on, and we went from dumb bombs to thermonuclear warheads, it was like, what do you say, bomb them back to the Stone Age, and all of a sudden everyone kind of reels off of them. They're like, all right, buddy, and you pump the brakes. Yeah, there's that same vibe with Angleton, right? He's vicious and he's a killer and you want him.
Yeah, and the important thing is, the American political system changed a lot between 1965 and 1975. American culture, American society, American thinking went through profound change. And the old certainties of World War II and the Cold War, they began to fade away. People said this Vietnam thing, it's a disaster. We can't win. It's awful. We're killing so many people. We're killing our own men. And so by the end, that change had come, and he was really kind of a man out of time. His time had passed him up. Which was really the Cold War. As the Cold War began to fade, Angleton lost credibility.
And this is more so wild speculation. So, how do you think you would feel about something like and this is, again, we can't base it in anything, so this is all speculation. How do you think you would feel about something like NSA surveillance, like a Clapper or a Hayden? I feel like you would lean on their sides.
Yeah, Angleton was the father of mass surveillance in the United States. Okay. In 1955, he took over a Pentagon program, which was very small. And the Pentagon program was, they would open the mail of servicemen, right? Steam it open, read the letter to see if they were in touch with foreigners, if they were going to run away with a foreign girl, that kind of thing. They were opening up a couple hundred letters a year where they had some basis of suspicion. So Angleton took control of that program, brought it into the CIA, and within 5 years, they weren't opening 100 letters a year. They were opening 8,000 letters a year. And so what Angleton did was he went to J. Edgar Hoover and he said, just, you want somebody's mail opened, give me the names and I'll give you back the product. Now, it's interesting that, Angleton, J. Edgar Hoover has quite a reputation as a repressive, spying type of guy. Angleton actually went farther than J. Edgar Hoover. J. Edgar Hoover never would have dared open U.S. citizens' mail. He was very sensitive to public opinion, didn't want to get caught. So when Angleton did it and then fed the information back to Hoover, he had the perfect out because it was not his responsibility, but he got the intelligence, he got the secrets. So that was a mass surveillance program. They didn't have to go to a FISA court to get a warrant. It was just, if Angleton put you on the list, and, a lot of people went on the list, like, Lee Harvey Oswald's mother, That's how interested he was in Lee Harvey, the thoroughly obscure Lee Harvey Oswald. He was reading his mother's mail starting in 1959.
And
so when you, just back to your original question, what would he think about mass surveillance? I think he would say, we need this program, and we shouldn't curb our ability to collect in any way. He would have been a hardliner with Hayden and Clapper, and saying, a kind of maximalist demand, which, was not really, wouldn't weigh civil liberties, into the equation, and would say the security questions are much more important than the civil liberties question. So I think I thought that when I was writing the book, that if Angleton were around today, that's what he would say.
Yeah. And there's always this, I know for at least me, I can obviously only speak from how my brain works. There's always a part of me that wants to believe these guys, these spooks who write from opening 8,000 letters to Echelon and tapping at like AT&T headquarters. Part of you wants to believe, and I say you, I mean me, that you got to have that patriarchal figure that goes in there, rolls up the sleeves and goes in and, to fight a demon, you need to become a demon, right? And they go in there, and but that's also what, am I getting intoxicated on patriotism? And I'm like, it's for the good. Like, if I just put it in a different filter, am I looking at, what if I said this in German? Would I be for it? Like,
yeah,
it's a shine of good. It's like, whoa, now all of a sudden it's Gestapo, but because it's my flag, it's, oh, this is what we need. It's always, but then you have, and then you have a 9/11 and you're like, well, should we have been, should we have done more? And then it all gets a foggy forest of mirrors.
Right. And we go through these and we lost in Vietnam. You get all these reports of spying and Watergate, and people they go more towards the liberty end of the equation, and they say, our liberty is threatened by this. We have to protect our liberties, and so Congress creates the Church Committee, the Senate Select Committee on the CIA, which investigates, the first real investigation of the CIA, and a lot of reforms are put in place. After Angleton, the FISA courts, the House and Senate Intelligence Committees, ban assassinations. That time heavily into the the liberty end of the equation. Then we have a 9/11. The pendulum swings back towards security, and a whole bunch of measures that once would have been thought to be repressive or questionable or impinging on people's rights, go through. And then now we've been through 20 years of endless war, and people are starting to say, hey, do we really need this? Isn't it excessive? And the pendulum's starting to swing back more towards, the civil liberties side of it. So that was, but in that, kind of historical progression, Angleton plays the leading role at the beginning. He lays out how the CIA is going to be extremely aggressive to the point of breaking the law.
Yeah.
In its efforts to fight the Soviet Union. And then, he was exposed as doing things that were not politically tenable, and he was fired.
Yeah. And I think it was, I know it's in your book. I don't remember if it's you quoting him or if I'm quoting you, but it's like, he was for breaking the laws to protect the law. Basically the cut the corners, right? That again, that 1984 justification that, I'm doing this for your own good type of thing.
Right.
But what we also know, and your book goes into it, and I was happy it did, was Operation Northwoods, and how, we were going to use that for justification and just bulldoze into Cuba. It seems like these guys obviously aren't stupid, right? They're in intelligence is they, I would think that they can look at someone like me. They're looking at, let's say it's in the 60s and they're like this young, pro-America, right? But he's eventually going to use his noggin and say, maybe these guys are overstepping their boundaries. Well, what would be the logical step to be ahead of me would go, well, what if we rile up that patriotism? What if we set some bombs off, blow up an airliner? It starts to, you look at Northwoods, and if there had never been a Northwoods document ever, it would be much easier to throw all this stuff in the conspiracy drawer. But because there was a Northwoods, and because it got approved by so many people, I can't help but look at something like a JFK or a 9/11, and it's just purely, and I'm not saying either of those are conspiracy, but I cannot push them away.
Right. No, and it's very important. And let me just, for readers who are not familiar with Northwoods, Operation Northwoods was a Pentagon plan approved by the Joint Chiefs of Staff in March 1962 and May 1963. And the Pentagon's analysis, and the plan was to provoke a war with Cuba. And the Pentagon's analysis was Fidel Castro was in power in Cuba. He was pretty strong. He was pretty popular. There was no way that his people were going to overthrow him from within. He had a pretty unified government. So there wasn't going to be a coup against him. There wasn't going to be a popular uprising. The only way to get rid of Castro, the Pentagon concluded, was to invade with, the 82nd Airborne, full-blown U.S. invasion.
Yeah.
The problem is that the president couldn't just order that. The public would say, why are we attacking a nation we're not at war with? So what you had to do, and what the Pentagon decided you had to do, was create a pretext. And so Operation Northwoods was what was called a pretext operation. And it was to create a pretext that would create the moment where the president could declare war against Cuba, invade, and overthrow the government. And so the way to do that, according to the men who planned Operation Northwoods, there were many variations. They developed about 15 different plans, but they all kind of followed the same template, which was stage a spectacular crime in the United States and arrange for the blame to fall on the enemy. It's a classic false flag operation. Now, like you said, Operation Northwoods wasn't like, the idea of some left-wing conspiracy theorist in Hollywood. And it wasn't, Oliver Stone didn't know about it. It didn't come out till 1997.
Yeah.
I mean, if it had, he would have had a field day with it because it is such a conspiratorial and corrupt thing. And in the Northwoods papers, they state, the planners state that this is, in a democratic society, this is obviously anathema. We have to be very careful, and we have to trust only our most trusted covert personnel.
Yeah.
So that is a useful description of James Angleton. And it's no surprise that Angleton is called in to assess the Cuba problem a couple of weeks after the Joint Chiefs approve Operation Northwoods for a second time in May 1963. So, this was the state of thinking in the U.S. High Command, and it differed markedly, dramatically from the approach of President Kennedy, who had rejected Operation Northwoods at a White House meeting in March 1962 and said he wasn't interested. There would be no pretext operations. Kennedy wanted to pursue overthrowing Castro, or maybe restoring relations with him, but he did not put a high premium on overthrowing the Cuban government. That was very, very different than the Joint Chiefs, who had a very different position throughout 1963. So, and then you mentioned Northwoods in connection with, the Kennedy assassination or 9/11, right? I mean, one of the Northwoods plans was to, fake a hijacking of a plane.
Yep.
Another was to stage a terror attack in Washington. So the concept is sinister and anti-democratic. And when you look at what happened on November 22nd, 1963, there was a spectacular crime against a target in America, and there was an immediate effort by CIA psychological warfare assets to blame the crime on Cuba.
Yeah.
So that's not quite proof that Operation Northwoods contributed to the Kennedy assassination, but we do know that that's the way a lot of powerful people in Washington were thinking in November 1963.
Yeah.
And we did not learn the story of of that plan. Nobody knew anything about it until 34 years later, after 4 different investigations of JFK's assassination. So this information had been held back for decades. So, it's an important part, and the fact that Angleton was brought into it, I think, and I say in the Ghost, I think is significant.
Yeah, and it's again to really drive home that point. This isn't Mr. Morley or myself. you know, we're half in the bag, and we're like, you know, I bet those top officials, I bet those spooks were great, because that's all just self-righteous. We're just beating our drums. The Joint Chiefs of Staff were like, this is good. We'll blow up an airplane, real or simulated. If you really want the blood, we can do it. We'll bomb some targets in Miami, blow up a couple shopping malls, and they're like, I mean, these are the top. This is like Dr. Strangelove. You know, they're in the big room, they're in the war room, and they're like, brilliant idea, just patting each other on the back, and it's like, okay. And then what? Top Dog says no, and then a couple months later, he gets a lobotomy in Dealey Plaza. Like, I don't know, man. It gets a little hairy, right?
It does. It does. And, you know, and that was why Operation Northwoods was held so closely for so many years. It was skating very close to the line of, you know, anti-democratic action. And you mentioned there, you know, let's do the attack, real or simulated. You know, like they were perfectly willing to, one of the plans was they would shoot up a boatload of Cuban refugees.
Yep.
And they had the same thing, real or simulated, right?
Yeah.
So imagine that, a boatload of people who are fleeing a communist dictatorship. We're allegedly welcoming them, and we are going to kill them. Kill them. That's the plan, approved by the Joint Chiefs, in order to overthrow Castro. Now, you know, is that a dirty trick? Is that justifiable? I mean, it's a pretty screwy way to do business and pretty indefensible, you know? Yeah. And that's why they hit it, because it was so indefensible. And because it raises perfectly legitimate suspicions about the assassination of President Kennedy. I mean, it just does. You can't pretend it doesn't.
Yeah, it 1000% does. And then not only that is, I mean, we talk about Angleton, who's this sort of, you know, for better or worse, going to protect this nation, even if you have to break the law. And then we have JFK, right? Who is, we got LeMay chomping at the bit, let's bomb them all. And it's just like, you know, it's like, dude, go take a Xanax, just relax. And, you know, he's like, no, we're going to do it. But then we've got Angleton, who's looking at him. And whereas from the outside, it looks like JFK's finest hour, right? We got to the brink, there's an embargo, and we walked away from it. Like, humanity prevailed, and you get all your goosebumps, and we did it. But it's like, did we really? Like, we were an overwhelmingly powerful nation, and what actually came out of it? They took their guys out. They took their missiles out of Cuba, okay, but what they get out of it? They got missiles withdrawn from Turkey. So what you draw is like, the Soviets got a win out of it.
Right. No, and that's how the Joint Chiefs looked at it, was they felt that Kennedy had a very strong hand and could have gotten a much better outcome. He could have gotten communism out of Cuba. Now, JFK, on the other hand, understood that these confident assumptions given to him by the Joint Chiefs that the U.S. would invade and it would be over in 18 days, that was the assessment he was given. He knew that was nonsense. And what's more, he was afraid of miscalculation. And he was afraid of, you know, they were installing nuclear weapons. Were the nuclear weapons, you know, functioning at that point? The CIA said no, which was true. But it wasn't until 30 years later, in 1992, when they got all the Russians, the Cubans, and the Americans at a conference in Havana, and they said, you know, what was going on? And, you know, McNamara said, well, we were pretty confident that we could have taken the island pretty easily. There were only 12,000 Soviet troops. And the Russian, you know, foreign minister, deputy foreign minister says, no, excuse me, Mr. Secretary, we did not have 12,000. We had 45,000 troops there. And he added another thing, which was, the forward commanders had tactical nuclear weapons. We were concerned about the missile bases, but those missile bases were also protected by Soviet forces that had access to Soviet nuclear weapons, and they had standing orders. If you are attacked, you don't have to ask Moscow for permission. Mm-hmm. You can fire right away if you are attacked. If you're not attacked, you got to check with us first, and we'll tell you when to fire. So if the United States had struck, it's virtually certain that nuclear weapons would have been used on the incoming U.S. troops. And then imagine, what's the U.S. president going to do?
Yeah, it's dominoes.
Right. There's no way a president could not respond to that.
Yeah.
And so Kennedy took the U.S. off the escalation ladder very early. The generals thought he was being weak. He thought he was being wise, and I think in retrospect, we can see that he was being very wise, but it was a profound difference of opinion about how to deal with the situation.
Yeah, in retrospect, I would say that I would think you could argue 99 out of 100 times he saved the world.
He did. I
Because,
think
yeah,
he definitely did. I think he definitely did.
I mean, yeah, nuclear doctrine says that massive retaliation. I mean, Garrett Graff's Raven Rock, I've had him on here finally.
Yeah.
But they talk about it. There's kind of like the field commanders, you can use it. I mean, that's what the thermonuclear doctrine was, is this all happens so fast that we have to have a game plan, a reflex that we go to. So if a nuke goes off, you don't have to, okay, what is the game plan say? You go, no, we're hitting Paris, we're hitting Moscow, we're hitting Sri Lanka. Why? Because the war games say that's what we're doing. This could have very quickly, I mean, it was almost Dr. Strangelove. This was a sort of end of the world mechanism. They use a tactical one on our guys invading. We go, we can't do that. We can't let them steal our thunder. So we hit them, they hit them, and next thing you know, the earth is a cinder.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, Angleton was not involved in the deliberations around the missile crisis. There weren't really counterintelligence issues involved, but he definitely sided with the Joint Chiefs over JFK in assessing how the crisis was handled. He felt that Kennedy had been weak, not wise.
Yeah. And but again, we didn't know any of that until years later. But I remember, I think it was Annie Jacobson said that in one of her books. So she was like, they found out a while ago that they absolutely had, you're right, maybe not the missiles aimed at DC and New York, but they had those little tactical ones that no one thought of. We would have walked right on in there, would have been game over for the whole world.
Yeah.
So in that, they thought he was weak, and they were like, this guy is. And so to pull it around, we've got Angleton going, okay, here's this guy that's already shown he's willing to cut corners. He's willing to cheat, right? He's willing to slit some throats along the way, probably literally as well as figuratively. Now he's looking at Kennedy. I could see Angleton, and I'm not backing it, but I'm just trying to look at it as like analytically. I could see Angleton 100%, in his ghost role. Okay, this guy is now a threat to the country. JFK. This guy is not strong enough to lead this thing. And is he going to be willing? Is Angleton now talking to himself? Obviously, I'm putting words in a dead man's mouth. Am I going to do anything to protect this nation?
Right. I mean, I think we can speculate about that. Angleton, we don't have a lot of access to Angleton's inner thinking compared to other people because he didn't leave behind an extensive correspondence or diary or even his office files were reintegrated into the CIA's archives, and we can't extract them now. So his trail is a little hard to cover. I mean, so rather than speculate about what he might or might not have been doing around Kennedy's assassination, I think if you look at what we know for sure that he did do, the monitoring and following of Lee Harvey Oswald, I mean, that alone tells you that, the story that the CIA and the Warren Commission told the American people in 1964, that this guy just, we had no reason to think anything of him. He just came out of nowhere and he shot the president. Sorry, Mrs. Kennedy. That was a cover story. Yeah. And it was a cover for the fact that Angleton and his people had been watching Oswald very carefully, and they had followed him. And, now you hear people say, well, yeah, sure, of course they were very interested in him. Well, first of all, the CIA never mentioned that at the time. They never told the investigators that at the time. That was only disclosed 15 or 20 years later in the 70s when the Church Committee, and we really didn't get the full story until the 2015 period, when the CIA finally started releasing the last or all of the extant Oswald file from before the assassination. They never lost interest in this guy. Top operations officers were deeply interested in Lee Harvey Oswald from November 1959 to November 1963. Wherever he went, they received reports on him from Office of Naval Intelligence, Department of Justice, FBI, State Department, and from their own people. By the time on November 21st, 1963, there were probably about 45 different documents in Oswald's CIA file. Okay. So like one a month for 4 years would be the average. Okay. So he was not somebody who wasn't known to US intelligence. That was the cover story.
Yeah.
The CIA and James Angleton's staff in particular were the most interested in it. Yeah. And yet they hid all of that from investigators.
Yeah. And this is why you're a best-selling author, and this is why I'm a podcaster, because I go to speculation and you're like, let's just look at what actually happened. But thank you for that, because you're right. It's not in an age of email. It's not like, because I'm sure I have a file, right? I'm sure you do. We all do, right? That's a norm now. But 59, and they have one on this guy. And then not even that. Maybe you could, so let's argue, well, anyone that defects to the Soviet Union, you're going to look after, and including an ex-Marine who said he was a radar operator. Like, okay, sure, let's go with that argument. But what it gets down to is, why the hell did they lie about it for 20 years, 30 years, or 15 years? Why, if you go, Tommy, when are you going to upload the podcast? And I say, I'm going to upload it tomorrow. Then I upload it tonight. Anyone else might be like, okay, whatever. There's just a difference in a couple hours. And true, it's not important. But you might be going, why did you lie about it? And then I'm going, well, why are you bothering me, Mr. Morley? You're going to be like, okay, now it's getting sketchy, right? So you have to look at why they're lying, not necessarily what they lie about.
And again, I mean, inevitably when you have a shortage of information or a lot of secrecy or a very tangled story, which you frequently have in intelligence operations, you say, well, I'm not sure, or I don't know. But if you want to limit the speculation, I mean, what would be the explanation for that? In the CIA context, the best explanation is that they were protecting the agency's sources and methods, right? They're not telling a lie for no reason. They're telling a lie because they have something to protect. Now, that could be embarrassment. We just missed this guy and he killed the president. That's one possibility. I doubt it. But the other possibility is they're running an operation with Oswald and they can't disclose sources and methods according to the law, according to their oath of office. And so that's why they hid it. And I think that's the most plausible explanation. Sure. I don't think it's because they were embarrassed. I think it's because they made operational use of Oswald and therefore were required to conceal all the sources and methods around him between 1959 and 1963. Sure. The point being, whatever, we can get on to the conspiracy question, but if you view the Kennedy assassination purely in CIA terms, in counterintelligence terms, it's a catastrophic failure. Angleton should have lost his job. He should have lost his job the next day. A defector from the Soviet Union comes back, marries a Russian woman, gets a gun, and shoots the president of the United States in broad daylight. That's a failure. Somebody should have lost their job, and nobody. No. So then you got to ask, well, why did they lied about this and nobody lost their job? And then another thing to remember about JFK is the fear of conspiracy around JFK's death was not created by conspiracy theorists, right? Because there were two polling organizations that went out right after the president was killed and conducted extensive polling. One was in Texas and one was nationwide. Reputable pollsters, representative sample, nationwide. And in both those polls, 60 to 70% of the people, this is based on just the news that people had seen. There are no JFK conspiracy theorists anywhere. To the contrary, the White House, the FBI, the Secret Service, the Dallas police, and your morning newspaper are all saying, this one guy killed the president, don't worry about it. In that environment, no conspiracy theorists, everybody's saying one guy did it. 2/3 of the public thinks that there was a conspiracy. Why? Because the circumstances of the crime were so suspicious. Yeah. So the important thing to remember is JFK conspiracy theories were not the product of JFK conspiracy theorists. They were created by the circumstances of the crime.
Yeah.
Some guy kills the president. A lot of people said gunfire came from two different directions. And then the guy who was charged gets killed.
Yeah.
That's a very suspicious set of circumstances. And so, of course, people thought, there's got to be more than one person involved. So
yeah, it's it's
And so then we, over the years, we have learned much, much more about just how much deception went into that cover story about Oswald, the alleged lone nut, who was actually of interest to a dozen top CIA operations officers for the last 40 years of his life.
Yeah, it definitely gets way too. Yeah, it's again, like, I'm just looking at, these are facts. I'm not making any claims, but it's like, you look at something like, okay, it's like 9/11. It's like they find the jet fuel soaked passport of one of the hijackers, and it's like they found that, but the plane disintegrated, right? And again, I'm not saying, but that is just a fact. And who found it? An FBI guy walking down the street, right? It's
Yeah.
who's the head of the FAA. It was his first day on the job. Cheney ordered NORAD to go out off the coast, and then they ran a drill about hijacked planes. And this isn't, and if anyone's saying you're a conspiracy theorist, I haven't said any conspiracy. I'm just naming facts. It leads to whether or not it was a catastrophic failure. Maybe that's what it was.
Okay.
The whole
We're getting a little far afield from Angleton.
I know. Sorry. Yeah. I know. But the point is I'm trying to draw an analogy.
Yeah.
It's the whether or not an actual conspiracy happened is the analogy I'm making. Is sometimes a situation is just so hairy, you can't help but, it's what if you were driving home and I'm on the side of the road, Mr. Morley, can you give me directions to Wendy's? And you're like, yeah, man, what are you doing? I was at the bar all night, and then I spill my cup of whiskey onto you, and then a cop pulls you over and goes, well, you reek of whiskey. Sometimes it really was weird shit, right? So I wasn't trying to go into a 9/11 so much.
Let me just say for the record, I do think 9/11 was a conspiracy. It was a conspiracy that was organized by Khalid Sheikh Mohammed.
Yeah.
It was bankrolled by Osama bin Laden.
Yeah, that's a conspiracy.
I agree with that.
Yeah, no, and I'm with that is. Yeah, that is a conspiracy. That was a conspiracy by a billionaire construction family who, had a bunch of their minions go out and attack the United States. That is a conspiracy in the true sense of the word. But it's, and I gotta let you go in 3 minutes. Is
any other thoughts?
Excuse me?
Any other thoughts? Or
yeah. So the end, right? When it's when they talked about Angleton and they're like, who killed JFK, or was that an agency? Was that an agency operation? And instead of just saying no, Angleton said something like, what was the quote? It was like, the CIA is a mansion and I don't know all the rooms.
My father's house is a mansion with many rooms, and I don't know who struck John.
Yeah,
and so he said that to Seymour Hersh, the famed investigative reporter. And I asked Hersh about it, and he said, I have no way to interpret that. Angleton was such a sort of, enigmatic character, prone to these profound statements. But he said, basically, I thought he was trying to lay the blame on, JFK's assassination on somebody besides the CIA. And I think that's a very reasonable way to read that comment.
Sure. Yeah. And it's, it kind of, when you said covering up their own inadequacy, their own incompetence, I can't help but think of the South Park episode where George Bush is talking to like Kyle or Stan, and he's walking away, and he goes, whoops, and he like pulls out this dossier and drops it on the ground and goes, I hope no one picks that up. And he picks it up, and it's like, the plan that the government did it. And he's like, why would you do this? And he goes, because if the people think we did this, they'll think we're more powerful than we are. It's like, because the truth is we just fucked up the whole thing. It was an incompetence nightmare. Maybe that's what it was. Is Angleton's just like, I can't believe a Soviet defector killed the president in Dallas. Like, holy shit, I'm so fired. And that's kind of what, that might be the most unsexy truth, but that might be the truth. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, you got to read The Ghost to find out.
You do. You absolutely have to read The Ghost to find out. We'll be in the top comment and in the description. Get it? Mr. Morley, thank you so much, sir. And I'm absolutely going to get your other book. And I hope to have you on again sometime.
Good, Tommy. Good discussion. I'd like to do it again.
Yes, sir. Thank you so much. Happy Thanksgiving, and thank you so much, sir. You have a good one.
You too. Send me a link when you put. Send me a link and I'll review it, and then we'll put it up.
I got you. Yes, sir. Happy Thanksgiving, everybody. Stay safe. God bless America. Mr. Morley, you have a good one.
Take care.